Ryan T. Anderson researches and writes about marriage and religious liberty as the William E. Simon Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He also focuses on justice and moral principles in economic thought, healthcare, and education, and has expertise in bioethics and natural law theory. He is the co-author with Princeton's Robert P. George and Sharif Girgis of the acclaimed book, What is Marriage? Man, Woman, a Defense. Ryan.
Great, thank you. So as Sharif mentioned, I'm going to talk about what the kind of practical implications are for the view that we sketch in our book. Because you could have followed everything Sharif said that, you're right. There is this comprehensive good called marriage, and we engage in it by a comprehensive act that unites a man and a woman as husband and wife. It then leads towards the comprehensive good of marriage, the creation and the raising of new life. It calls for comprehensive norms, monogamy, exclusivity, and permanency. But why should we care? And more specifically, why should we care for public policy? Why should we care for the law? Why should the state of Utah care? Why is Utah in the marriage business in the first place? So in the time I have, I want to answer that question, why does marriage matter for public policy purposes? And then I'll close with a couple considerations of what will the consequences be of redefining marriage. I'll make some predictions. What will happen as a result of those states that are being forced to redefine marriage because of the courts? Now, one interesting thing is to say that the state's not in the baptism or bar mitzvah business. So the state's not in the marriage business because of its sacred character. The state's not in the marriage business because it's a covenant or a sacrament or something like that. So why is the state in the marriage business? We argue that the government cares about marriage because it's the institution that brings together a man and a woman as husband and wife to then be mother and father to any children that union might produce. That's so understood, marriage is based on an anthropological truth that men and women are distinct and complementary. It's based on a biological fact that reproduction requires both a man and a woman, and it's based on a social reality that children deserve both a mother and a father. That whenever a child is born, a mother's always close by. Normally, she'll be in the same room. That's a fact of biology. The question for law, the question for culture, is will a father be close by? And if so, for how long? And the reasons that societies all across the globe and all throughout human history have recognized marriage as a union of a man and a woman is precisely to maximize the likelihood that that man commits to that woman, and then the two of them, committed to each other, take responsibility for raising that child. And now one of the reasons why this matters is that when this doesn't happen, when spouses fail to commit to each other before having children, or where they fail to live out that commitment for the long haul, social consequences run high. That if you want to look at the social science, and I'll pivot to that in a minute, that it's that marriage has a public significance, and it impacts the public common good in a way that other types of friendships and relationships simply do not. Part of this argument is that there's no such thing as parenting. There's no such thing as parenting in the abstract. There's mothering and there's fathering. Mothers and fathers bring different gifts to the parenting enterprise. I'll read you one quote to illustrate this, and then I'll do some thought experiments with you just to see how much this is now common sense knowledge. David Popenoe's recently passed away, sociologist at Rutgers University, and he did a literature review on what we knew about parenting back when the big social crisis in America was absentee fathers. He was doing his research with children growing up without fathers. He wrote a book, Life Without Father, and here's some of what he concluded. He said, quote, "The burden of social science evidence supports the idea that gender-differentiated parenting is important for human development, and the contribution of fathers to child rearing is unique and irreplaceable." He then concluded, quote, "We should disavow the notion that mommies can make good daddies, just as we should disavow the popular notion that daddies can make good mommies. The two sexes are different to the core, and each is necessary culturally and biologically for the optimal development of a human being." Now, what does he mean by this? Here we can do a simple thought experiment. If I tell you it's Saturday morning and a 5-year-old boy is in the living room wrestling with one of his parents. And this parent is teaching the boy to be masculine and aggressive, but not to be violent. That it's okay to put people in headlocks, but it's not okay to bite or to pull hair or to gouge out eyes. Which parent is most likely in the living room? And the laughter gives it away that you know it's the father. And this isn't because we've engaged in gender stereotypes in which only fathers can wrestle with 5-year-old boys. It's that this is what tends to come naturally to dads. This is how dads enjoy interacting with their 5-year-old sons. In the same way that it's typically the father who throws the newborn baby up in the air, and it's the mother who says, honey, not so high. That's a behavior. It's not that we've engaged in gender stereotypes in which only mothers can say not so high. That's what comes naturally to moms. They tend to be the more protective, the more nurturing. Maybe it's a result of having carried the child in the womb for 9 months, that there's a hardwire connection to be more concerned about physical safety and things like that, whereas for fathers, there's that tendency towards what the sociologists call rough and tumble play. And so what the father does for the 5-year-old boy in the living room, wrestling, teaching, headlocks are good, but gouging out eyes not good. What the father does with the 10-year-old boy, perhaps throwing around a football in the backyard. What the father does with the 15-year-old boy, preparing him for his first high school dance. All of those things are helping that young man develop into a law-abiding, productive member of society, channeling distinctively masculine tendencies in a constructive rather than a destructive fashion. And so when we step back from the anecdote, it's an anecdotal piece of evidence when I asked you about the 5-year-old in the living room, we look at all the social science. The social scientists tell us that boys who grow up without their fathers, more likely to commit crime, less likely to graduate from school, more likely to end up in jail, less likely to be employed. And why is it that what's taking place in the living room at age 5, in the backyard at age 10, upstairs in the bedroom at age 15, getting ready for the dance, those are all ways in which fathers are shaping their boys into productive members of society. Now, dads do something complementary for their daughters. Fathers, on average and for the most part, are larger than mothers. Fathers, on average and for the most part, have deeper voices than mothers. Fathers, on average and for the most part, were once young boys themselves. You have to say on average and for the most part with that one because of the transgender issue. All of those things give fathers a unique capacity and a unique interest in what sort of young man is pursuing their daughter, what sort of boy is taking their daughter on dates. And so that ability, that deeper voice, that larger body structure, that he was once himself a young boy, makes him more sensitive to whether the right sort of guy is taking his daughter out. A father who's married to his daughter's mother also models what a good marital relationship looks like. He models what a good male-female relationship looks like, and therefore what the daughter should be looking for in a husband. So then when you take a step back from the anecdote, the social scientist tells us that girls who grow up without their fathers more likely to engage in sexual activity earlier, more likely to have pregnancy outside of marriage. So there are these broader consequences once you step back. But don't take my word for this. Let me read you a quote, and then I'll ask you who the speaker is. We know the statistics. Children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They're more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves, and the foundations of our community are weaker because of it. Who's the speaker of that quote? Barack Obama, before he evolved. And President Obama has, he's spoken several times in very movingly phrased statements about the importance of fathers, and a couple of times he's explained why. And so when he gave the commencement address at Morehouse College is an all-male college, he's addressing the all-male graduating class, and he says, quote, "I have tried to be for Michelle and my girls what my father was not for my mother and me. I want to break that cycle." End quote. That highlights why government's in the marriage business, why the state of Utah is in the marriage business. It's not because the government's a sucker for romance. It's not because the government cares about your love life or my love life, because it's really concerned about the butterflies that we get in our stomachs when we fall in love. If that was all that marriage was about, the state could not take any cognizance of it. The state could be out of the bedroom. But the reason the government's in the marriage business is that sexual union of a man and a woman can produce a child, and that child deserves the best shot of having a mother and a father raise them to maturity. And when this doesn't happen, all of those statistics that Obama recited for us about crime, about drug use, about prisons, about not graduating from school, about not being employed, about out-of-wedlock pregnancy in turn, and the cycle that then perpetuates follows in the wake. So what we've seen is that if you care about social mobility and you care about limited government, if you care about freedom and you care about the poor, if you care about social justice and you care about civil society, all of these things are much better served by a healthy marriage culture, by a healthy civil society that does what it's supposed to do, rather than a big government solution that tries to pick up the pieces, either in the form of a welfare state or in the form of a police state. How do you fill in for that absentee dad? A welfare state to provide a check and a police state to provide discipline. And they don't produce good outcomes, they cost a lot of money. So what we've seen in the past 50 years, we've had a breakdown in the American family. As Richard mentioned, none of the people who've been doing work on the marriage issue got into this primarily because of same-sex marriage. They got into this because of marriage. And the concern here was that 50 years ago, something started to change. 50 years ago, births to single mothers were in the single digits. Today, 40% of all Americans, 50% of Hispanics, and over 70% of African Americans are born to single moms. And the challenges for those children and for those families and for those communities are significant. Now, we don't want to overstate what those challenges are. Obviously, President Obama has turned out fairly well. He's doing pretty good for himself in the White House. But he and his mom would be some of the first people to tell you that it was an uphill struggle. And that's why he's spoken out on the importance of mothers and fathers for children. But that then leads to what I'll close with is, what are the consequences of redefining marriage? Because you could be saying, I'm following what you and Sharif are saying. I'm following Sharif's presentation that marriage is a comprehensive union of sexually complementary spouses, where the act that unites spouses also creates new life. I'm following what you're saying, that the state's really in the marriage business because this new human life needs a mom and a dad, and we have to have an institution that encourages men and women to commit as husband and wife to then be mother and father. But how does redefining marriage in any way impact that? What's the harm is the shorthand way that people sometimes will pose that question. And let me identify 3 consequences of redefining marriage. And all 3 fall under the general rubric of ideas have consequences and bad ideas have bad consequences. And as Sharif mentioned, there are 2 different visions of what marriage is. There's the consenting adult love vision of marriage, where marriage is about your number one person, it's about an intense emotional relationship. And then there's the comprehensive union vision of marriage. The state will promote one or the other of these 2 visions of marriage. And the law will teach that one or the other is the truth about marriage. The law will then shape our culture. The culture in which we and our children and our grandchildren live will then shape our beliefs, and then our beliefs will shape our actions. And so all 3 of these consequences follow from that general framework. And let me spell them out one by one. The first is that if you redefine marriage to make it a genderless institution, there's no institution of civil society, there's no institution of public life left that upholds even as an ideal that every child has a right to a mother and a father. What redefining marriage does is it makes it more about the desires of the adults than about the needs or the rights of children. Redefining marriage to make it a genderless institution sends the signal that men and women are interchangeable and therefore mothers and fathers are replaceable. And if you doubt that the law has this capacity to teach, the thought experiment that I would offer to you, or the case study that I would offer for you, is the case of NoFault Divorce. Prior to the introduction of NoFault Divorce laws in the United States, if you were to file for divorce, you would cite one of the 3 A's from the common law tradition. And the 3 A's are just a handy way of summarizing these. But the 3 A's were abuse, abandonment, and adultery. Serious reasons for saying that a relationship that was expected to be permanent had to now be declared over by a court of law. My spouse is abusing me, my spouse has abandoned me, my spouse has committed adultery. Serious reasons for terminating what would otherwise have been a permanent relationship. But with no-fault divorce, you could now abandon your spouse for any reason, even for no reason at all. You didn't have to cite grounds for divorce. That's what the no-fault part of no-fault divorce indicates. Some scholars refer to it as unilateral no-fault divorce because you also don't have to have your spouse's consent. So you can abandon your spouse for any reason or no reason at all without their consent. And so some legal scholars have said that in many jurisdictions, you have a greater legal obligation to your roofer or your plumber than you do to your spouse. There's no such thing as unilateral, no-fault, get out of your roofing contract. Either your roofer has to consent or you have to cite fault for why you're reneging on that plumbing or that roofing contract. Not so with the marriage contract. And so over time, this taught something. This taught that marriage need not even aspire to being a permanent relationship, that marriage can be gotten out of for frivolous reasons. And it oriented people's attitudes towards looking to that exit, looking to the way out of a marriage rather than working to salvage a marriage. And what we saw was that divorce rates more than doubled as a result during the first 20 years after the introduction of no-fault divorce laws. Now, not all of this change in marital behavior is a result of the law. The law shapes culture, but also the culture shapes the law in the first place. And as Sharif mentioned, one of the popular mantras from the 60s was that marriage should last as long as the love lasts. And so it was that vision of what marriage is that then gave rise to bad marriage laws, which in turn then gave rise to even worse marital practice. That our understanding of marriage and the law will mutually reinforce each other, either for the good or for the ill. And now the same thing will take place with redefining marriage to include same-sex couples. You know, I mentioned that right now 40% of all Americans, 50% of Hispanics, and over 70% of African Americans are born to single mothers. This is what's inspired Obama to speak out about the importance of fathers. But how will we as a society insist that those fathers are essential when the laws redefined marriage to make fathers optional? That's the first consequence of redefining marriage. Now, the second consequence is that redefining marriage won't stop here. And Sharif kind of began his presentation by pointing to the logical realities of what the revisionist account of marriage entails. That if you really think marriage is just about the person you love, why would any of the 3 traditional Western marital norms be retained? And not only is that a logical truth, a philosophical truth, we're now seeing that there are activists who are challenging those 3 marital norms of monogamy, exclusivity, and permanency, and that there's a certain logic to what they're doing. So I want to introduce you to 3 words, one of which Sharif mentioned, stealing some of my thunder, but we'll forgive Sharif. I just want to introduce you to 3 words that publications, New York Times, New York Magazine, and Washington Post. So 3 mainstream kind of cutting edge, but not really far out liberal publications have introduced about where they would like to see subsequent marriage redefinitions go. And what's mainstream today in New York City and California will one day be imposed on you in Utah and in Texas and Alabama. That's how many of these social changes take place. It was only a decade ago that the courts in Massachusetts redefined marriage there, and 11 years later, a court did it to you in Utah. So it's good to kind of be aware of what's at that cutting edge. So the first is the term throuple. A throuple is a 3-person couple. Take the word couple, chop off the C, and then add a THR. And this was the word that Sharif mentioned was in New York Magazine, and it was a profile of a 3-person relationship. This is called polyamory. It's different than polygamy. Polyamory is the entire ensemble is married to each other. And here was a case of 3 men who lived with each other and loved each other, and they took care of each other, and they wanted to have joint bank accounts, and they wanted to co-own their property, and all 3 be on the deed to the car, and this, that, and the other thing. And the basic argument was that if marriage is just about an intense, emotional, romantic, caregiving relationship, why can't we be married? If you go before the Supreme Court and you say, we demand marriage equality for the same-sex couple, why not marriage equality for the same-sex throuple or the opposite-sex quartet? Because the way that we arrived at monogamy in Western law and culture is that it's one man and one woman who can unite in the act that can produce new life, and every new life has one mother and one father. And marriage is about uniting those people in a stable, exclusive, permanent relationship. But once you say the male-female aspect of marriage is irrational and arbitrary and bigoted, what's magical about the number two? What's your principled basis for retaining marriage as the union of couples rather than of thruples or quartets, once you've said male-female, irrational, arbitrary, and bigoted? So that was the term throuple. Let me mention the next term. This was in the New York Times Sunday magazine, which is probably the most prominent publication in American public life. And it was a profile of the gay rights activist Dan Savage. And Dan Savage there introduced me to the word monogamish. So Savage wants to, so monogamish it's the word monogamous, but chop off the ending and add an ish, because it's kind of monogamous. He wants to retain the number two, so he thinks marriage should be the union of two people. He just doesn't think we should be so uptight about infidelity. His argument here is that it's unrealistic to think that all of your sexual needs can be met by one spouse for the rest of your life. That this is a holdover from an out-of-date Judeo-Christian moral tradition that we need to leave behind. And his argument was that many marriages actually fail because the couples are expecting sexual fidelity, sexual exclusivity, and when that doesn't happen, it tears them apart. And that one thing that opposite-sex relationships could learn from same-sex relationships was the virtue of the open relationship, what he termed the monogamish relationship. He argued that provided there's no coercion and there's no deceit, married couples should be free to seek out sexual relationships with people other than their spouse. That the marriage could actually be enhanced if marriage is understood as their romantic relationship, their caregiving relationship, if they weren't also seeking all of their sexual fulfillment only from their spouse. And that this would be a good further revision, further redefinition of marriage. What used to be the vice of infidelity would now be the virtue of a monogamish relationship. The last term is just now slightly over a year old. It was in the Washington Post 1 year ago it was either July or August. So it was right after the Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act. Very convenient timing. It was written by a lawyer, and he introduced me and my co-authors to the word wed lease. Wed lease is a play on the word wedlock. If wedlock denotes something that's strong and sturdy and permanent, wed lease was meant to denote the exact opposite. So just like you could lease a car or lease a house, this lawyer was proposing that you should be able to lease your spouse, that we should have expressly temporary marriage license. That one of the problems with the way marriage is practiced in the United States is that we have this holdover, out-of-date Judeo-Christian ethic that says marriage should be permanent. And he was saying, no, maybe we should keep the monogamy part, maybe we should even keep the exclusivity part, but you shouldn't think that you can live and love one person till death do you part. That's unrealistic. That's inhumane. The problem with divorce is that you had this unrealistic expectation that you would live and love one person for the rest of your life. When that inevitably falls apart because you can't really live that out, that's what causes all of the heartache and all of the pain and suffering of divorce. But if you only signed up for a wed lease in the first place, if you only signed up for a 5 or a 10-year marriage license, if it was going well at the end of its term, you could renew it, just like you can renew the lease on your apartment or your car. But if it wasn't going wrong, it would just automatically dissolve. You didn't sign up for wedlock, you signed up for wed lease. And as a result, you wouldn't have your emotions hurt. Nothing wrong would happen to your family. Interestingly enough, not once did he mention children in his op-ed for the Washington Post. Now, those three further redefinitions, the throuple, the monogamous relationship, the wed lease, all three of them, regardless of what you might think about the morality of sexually open, multi-partner, temporary relationships, whatever you might think about the theology of such relationships, I just want to focus on the public policy implications. If you remember, I started my talk by saying that the state's in the marriage business to get a man and a woman to commit to each other permanently and exclusively so that any children they create have the love and the care of a mother and a father. But the wed lease and the throuple and the monogamous relationships, they all directly undercut that purpose of marriage. Because the throuple, the wed lease, the monogamous relationship, they increase the number of sexual partners men and women have, and they decrease the amount of commitment that they have to each other. So they increase the likelihood of creating fragmented families and fatherless children, and they decrease the odds of permanency, stability, monogamy. And yet all three of those revisions follow as night follows on day once you get rid of the male-female procreative aspect part of marriage. Once you say that Sharif's explanation of the conjugal comprehensive union view of marriage is irrational and arbitrary, what's principled about monogamy, exclusivity, and permanency? Why not thruples, monogamous relationships, and wed leases if marriage is just about consenting adult love? See, the problem here is that we think that the redefinition of marriage will ultimately lead towards the dissolvement of marriage, that the logic of redefining marriage is simply a dissolvent. It dissolves marriage into consent. And consent can come in as many different sizes and shapes as is imaginable. Consent can be between 2, 3, 4, or more. Consent can be for a permanent or a temporary commitment. It can be an exclusive or an open commitment. And you can put up a red equals sign on your Facebook page and say all of those relationships demand marriage equality as well. And it doesn't get you anywhere, just as Sharif said. And yet all of these are already being already have activists agitating for them. And as a logical matter, it's very hard to see why an impartial court would stop it. Lastly, the third consequence that I'll mention is the consequence for religious liberty. And this is the consequence that we're living with, I think, most immediately. I mentioned it last because I think it's least important for the marriage culture itself. I think I want to highlight that redefining marriage has consequences for marriage, first and foremost, which is why I lead with the first two consequences. But the one that we will experience first and foremost will be whether or not we even have the freedom to live out and witness to the truth about marriage. Because what I said was that the law is going to teach something about marriage, and the law will either teach that people who believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman are rational, reasonable, good citizens, or the law will teach people and institutions who think marriage is the union of a man and a woman are irrational haters, who deserve to be marginalized from society and who deserve to be treated like we treat bigots. And we're already seeing this playing out. So shortly after the Massachusetts court forced that state to redefine marriage, we saw that Catholic Charities was forced out of the adoption space. And this has happened in Massachusetts, it's happened in Illinois, it's happened in Washington, D.C. That Christian-run adoption agencies that wanted to find homes for orphans with married moms and dads were told that's discrimination. And they were told specifically in Massachusetts that we won't give you a license to run the adoption agency unless you place children with same-sex married couples on an equal basis as you do with married mothers and fathers. And the charity said, we have social science that show that mothers and fathers aren't the same thing and that children do best with a mom and a dad. We also have the First Amendment that protects our religious liberty to run our charities in accordance with our beliefs. But the states in District of Columbia said no. They said you're violating our non-discrimination ordinance. If you don't treat the same-sex couple in the same way as the opposite-sex couple, we won't give you the license. And it's illegal to run an adoption agency without an adoption license, and so they were forced to close. What's worth highlighting about this is that shutting down adoption agencies does absolutely nothing to help children find homes. None of those children who were looking for adoptive families were helped by shutting down the Catholic Adoption Agency. And adopting a child is not like getting your oil changed or renewing your driver's license at the DMV. It's a very kind of intimate, personal experience where you may want a faith tradition to guide you along the way of welcoming a new human being into your family. Catholic Charities had a long track record. They were taking care of orphans long before the state was taking care of orphans. And yet they were told, unless you do it our way, we're going to shut you down. It does nothing to help those children. It does nothing to help prospective families get connected to children. All it does is score a point for political correctness. It sends the message that those who believe marriage is a male-female relationship and that children deserve a mom and a dad are on the wrong side of history, and we will force them to get with the movement. Since then, we've seen cases that involve bakers and florists and photographers. Most recently, a case in New York State that involved farmers, and now a case just this past weekend in Idaho that involves ordained ministers who run a wedding chapel. And in all of these cases, they were told, you have to help celebrate the same-sex wedding, otherwise you're running afoul of our non-discrimination statute. If you're not the wedding photographer for the same-sex wedding, if you don't bake the wedding cake, if you don't do the floral arrangements in the case of New York State, if you don't have the same-sex wedding in your home. The farmers lived on the second and the third floor of their barn. They rented out the first floor of their barn about a dozen times a year for weddings. They were approached by a same-sex couple. They said, we're sorry, we can't have a same-sex wedding in our home. It violates our beliefs about what marriage is. They were sued, and they were then fined $13,000. They had to pay $10,000 to the state of New York and $1,500 to both of the women for their pain and suffering. The case going on right now in Idaho, it's a married couple, ordained ministers in the Church of the Foursquare Gospel. It's a large evangelical church. They run a wedding chapel, and they were told that now that the court had redefined marriage in the state of Idaho, they had to celebrate same-sex weddings in their wedding chapel, or else they would be running afoul of the city's non-discrimination ordinance. In the case of Elaine Photography, that's the most famous one. She's an evangelical photographer in New Mexico. She was asked to be the wedding photographer for a same-sex commitment ceremony, and when she politely declined, she was sued. She was then fined $7,000. They litigated this all the way up to the state Supreme Court. In the state Supreme Court, one of the judges in his concurring opinion said, the price of citizenship is that Elaine has to take these pictures. Elaine has to set aside her religious beliefs and take these pictures. Now, what's interesting is that Elaine wasn't trying to prevent some other photographer from doing the same-sex wedding photos. Catholic Charities wasn't preventing same-sex couples from adopting kids from the government-run agency or from the secular humanist agency. All of these people simply asked for the freedom to be left alone. They simply wanted to run their business in accordance with their beliefs about marriage. They weren't imposing their values on anyone. They weren't preventing other people from having a wedding celebration, from having someone else do the wedding cake. And yet in all of these cases, they lost their lawsuits precisely because the government's trying to send a signal that those who believe this about marriage are not welcomed as full members of our community. What's particularly interesting about this is that none of the cases that we know of have the evangelicals, Catholics, whoever at hand, had a monopoly on the service. In the state of New Mexico, there are plenty of other photographers, many of whom support same-sex marriage, all of whom are interested in making money. So it would have been fine to say, rather than the price of citizenship is that Elaine has to take these pictures, the price of citizenship should be just go to a different photographer. In the case of Idaho, this wedding chapel is directly across the street from the county clerk's office. Just get your marriage license from the county clerk. Why force the evangelical ministers into performing your wedding in their chapel? But again, that's one of the consequences based upon the idea of the law teaching bad ideas having bad consequences. And what's being taught there, the left on this issue is hijacking the language of the civil rights movement. And they're saying that if you are against same-sex marriage, it's the same thing as being against interracial marriage. Even though for all of the reasons that Sharif laid out, those two cases have nothing to do whatsoever historically, philosophically, or theologically. It's a very convenient club to use to beat up on people. So with that, I think I'll stop, and then Sharif and I think the whole panel will come up and we'll do questions and answers. Thank you.